Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Everybody's Business from Bloomberg Businessweek. I'm Stacey Vanek-Smith.
And I'm Max Chafkin. Stacey, this week we're going to talk about the economic impact of the conflict in Iran.
We're also going to take a look at private equity, which is becoming a bigger and bigger part of our lives.
And we'll have an underrated story about an underrated presidential candidate.
Yes, who is very famous, has a reality show, is known for his straight talk, but is not Donald Trump.
All right. Before we get into the meaty conversation that we're going to have, I feel like I'd be wrong, Stacey, if I didn't bring up the fact that summer's beginning, that kids are getting out of school. It is a joyous time for many people in the United States, as chaotic and as scary as the world is at times.
It's true. And here at Everybody's Business, we have a lot of little kids, not technically on the staff, but definitely attached to the staff. And they come up a lot when we're talking as a team, but we never actually hear them.
Which is a shame, because not only are the children our future, but they are an important economic force, right? When I see my three children, I don't think, this is my legacy on Earth. I think three consumers, the consumers of tomorrow. Here they are. We can study them. They are going to be what keeps our economy going and what cares for us in our decrepitude.
So we thought we would hear from them to ask the kids of Everybody's Business how they are planning to spend their money this summer.
Well, I have $200-something, but unfortunately for my behalf, I lost my wallet, so I don't have any major plans. I don't really have money. Makeup for Halloween, like Old Navy and Sephora, and Coco, like the bubble tea place.
Anything that you will buy for yourself?
T-shirts, necklaces, anything.
A jacket.
What are you excited to buy this summer?
I'm excited to buy a basketball hoop.
Ooh, how much do you think it costs?
$100. A big ice cream truck with a big chili cat on the top.
Lois, do you know what a tariff is?
Something Trumplex?
Do you know what a tariff is?
A what?
A tariff?
No.
It's a tax for imports.
Saul, what's a tariff?
I don't know.
Do you know what inflation is?
Are you talking about, like, balloon inflation? or like a different type of inflation? Like, it has to do with money. Yes. That's all I'm guessing.
Wow.
My son lost his wallet.
Yeah,
it happens to all of us.
It's in his sock drawer. It's there. But I was a little disappointed that they didn't have like a more nuanced understanding of what a tariff was. But on the other hand, they did kind of get the essential of it.
I feel like almost no one understands exactly how tariffs work and what they are. And despite, a raft of explainer pieces, having written them, I sometimes don't feel like I entirely have a grasp of tariffs. I actually think they have a pretty sophisticated grasp of the economy, and inflation like a balloon, that's not wrong.
Stacey, what are you going to buy this summer?
What am I going to buy this summer? I have plans to do like an ice cream crawl. I want to try all the best ice cream in New York.
Love it.
That's my plan.
That's
do you have
seasonally? I'm going to buy all the stuff you just heard about.
Oh, that's true. Your spending plans have been laid out by small children.
All right, Stacey, we were planning on having a whole very entertaining conversation about the NBA Finals today.
Best laid plans.
But we just thought that right now, the most important story, even the most important business story, really, is what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. The conflict between Israel and Iran, which began on Friday of last week. We are recording as of right now. It is Wednesday. And it has just been escalating. Israel has been intensifying their bombings, and Donald Trump has started posting on social media a lot of threats that even suggest the U.S. might join the conflict.
Yeah, this is a bit outside of what we usually talk about, and neither Stacey nor I is an expert in grand strategy, even though it might seem that way sometimes. But this conflict has economic implications, and really important economic implications, both for the people who are in the Middle East, who are affected by what is happening, but also the markets, of course. And that's why we wanted to bring in John Authers. He's a Bloomberg opinion columnist. markets editor, and he's been writing about this in his newsletter, Points of Return. He is here with us right now, joining us from Madrid, I believe. Hey, John.
Yes, I am indeed in Madrid. Glad to be with you.
So, John, on Tuesday morning, this was before President Trump had put out a series of increasingly aggressive truths, posts on Truth Social saying, unconditional surrender, all caps, or we know exactly where the so-called supreme leader, that's in scare quotes, is hiding. He's an easy target, but he's safe there. We're not going to take him out, kill, at least not for now. You basically said at that point that the markets hadn't reacted very much to what was actually like a kinetic conflict. There were bombs flying in both directions, and yet the markets were barely moving. Can you talk us through your sort of thinking there? Is that observation still true?
That observation is still more or less true. Basically, you'd had a fairly dramatic response to the news which broke Friday morning American time, all of which was corrected back on Monday, with the exception of the oil price, which is still somewhat higher than it was. And that makes sense because the risk of a Middle Eastern conflagration is that it affects the supply of oil, that it affects the ability of Western companies to access the product, and also obviously its price.
Like a regional war between two potentially nuclear powers could have a bad effect on the global economy, is what you're saying.
Nuclear war would be bad for the stock market, yes. I will stand firm on that position, yes.
I do have a question about the impact on specifically oil markets, because Iran has a huge amount of oil. It's one of the biggest producers in the world, but they've also been under sanction that was actually put in place by Donald Trump in 2018. There aren't very many places they can even sell their oil right now. It's mostly to China. So I was wondering why you were expecting to see a bigger global impact given how restricted things are.
Okay, I was expecting that question. So 12-month moving average of Iranian oil exports to China, it's increased tenfold since 2022. And it's currently higher than it has been. The Bloomberg data I'm looking at goes back to 2015. It's comfortably higher exports to China than there have ever been at that point. You know, I think I'm right in saying we're still the world's biggest consumer of oil. That's quite a big problem. That does potentially mean that one of the most alarming possibilities facing us is much less likely to happen, which is that Iran could close the Straits of Hormuz, which would basically mean that most of Saudi Arabian oil and most of Iranian oil couldn't get out of the Gulf. But as substantially all of the oil they sent to China goes through the Straits of Hormuz, that would be a very dangerous thing for them to do. We can assume that China really does not want them to do that.
Yes. And the Strait of Hormuz is a strait between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. It is the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf out into the open ocean. And so much of the world's oil goes through there.
Very small band of water that Iran effectively controls. Stacey, can we just talk a little bit about what the economy of Iran is like apart from the question of oil exports and like what the sanctions have meant for people who live there and for the country as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, this really got started in 2018 when President Trump pulled us out of we had an Iranian nuclear deal and put in the highest level of sanctions against Iran and also threatened sanctions against anybody who did business with them. At the time, it was just really devastating because Iran was doing a lot of business with Japan. It was doing a lot of business with Italy. GE, Boeing had like multi-billion-dollar contracts there. All of those things disappeared overnight. People lost their jobs. Right now, 50% of Iranians live below the poverty line. I mean, this is a very highly educated population. Iran has everything to have a real powerhouse economy. It really hamstrung them. For the lives of people there, inflation 40%, like prices going up. I mean, it decimated the economy.
There's decimated a weird paradox here, which is that you can at once be cut off from large aspects of the global economy and still be a global actor. So like Iran is basically a pariah state as far as like the U.S. is concerned. You know, we're not selling them consumer goods. U.S. companies aren't doing business here. And yet, John, like you're saying, there are a lot of interdependencies, starting with the oil exports to China, you know, the Strait of Hormuz. Like there are ways in which if something bad happens in Iran, it will affect all of us.
Yes, Iran has more than 90 million people in it. It's actually quite an advanced economy. You cannot remove it completely from the global picture. It will have a very significant influence, and it has ways of exerting that influence.
One of the things you brought up in this newsletter that I mentioned from a couple of days ago was that basically markets never go down when there's a global conflict. Like that it really has to be bad on like historic proportions. I think in this piece you said, Hitler invading France, that was one where there was like a protracted decline. The 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Israel's neighbors attacked it, a surprise attack. I mean, on one hand, it's kind of comforting, like, wow, stock market traders are just like very chill. It also it strikes me as a somewhat dark observation. And it feels like what you've been kind of writing about and pushing towards is this idea that this confidence that everything's fine may be misplaced.
Well, I certainly fear that it is. I'm paid to try to find where people might be getting things wrong. It is unquestionably true that for the most part, markets can deal with geopolitical shocks in the short term. Many geopolitical shocks aren't that clear at the time and take a long time to take an effect. So there is, in the jargon, there's a tail risk, but on average, when you have a shock that creates a big sell-off, it's over inside a month. And because traders know this, it's widely known, there then becomes an assumption. This is what I believe. This is what they are assuming without realizing, that all geopolitical shocks can be ignored, because most geopolitical shocks can be ignored. You are making an assumption if you don't think that this is going to be more like the Yom Kippur War than like the Six-Day War, which had almost no impact on the markets when it happened.
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of playing out some of these tail risks that you're seeing, some of the potential fallout from a conflict, short, obviously, of nuclear Armageddon, but between Iran's oil exports and the Straits of Hormuz, like, what are some risks that you're seeing looking at this?
One interesting way to look at this is that Iran wants the US to restrain Israel rather than to egg it on. And very counterintuitively, the way to do that might be to start attacking oil infrastructure, to start expanding the war. And that, I think, is one of the great concerns, is that Iran is weaker than it was before, but it could close off the Straits of Hormuz if it genuinely has reason to believe that the US is thinking of assassinating their supreme leader. Things are getting very serious. Maybe they do play that desperate card of closing the Straits of Hormuz.
And that cuts a lot of the world off from a lot of the world's oil.
Yes, that cuts off most Saudi production and Kuwait and Iraq and Iran, which is a lot. So that is the single greatest concern out there. Also, the idea of whether you get attacks on other countries, whether they try to limit production in other countries, given that the degree of hostility there is between Iran and the other countries in the region. That's a Machiavellian response that makes it very hard for the US to continue to push on. And then the other big tail risk that I think is what scared people on Tuesday after you had those Donald Trump tweets was, oh Lord, he's really thinking he's going to change the regime here. This fear that it will create a new fiscal drag on the US, that all of a sudden there will be this massive new overseas commitment requiring money, feeding into all the worries about fiscal policy, that it's possible that the US is about to be dragged into an extremely expensive mistake.
John, you brought up Trump's statements. In your newsletter this morning, you wrote a really interesting sentence. These gyrations, you're talking about the market gyrations, oil going up, oil going down, have happened with no obvious concrete new developments, driven instead largely by the news flow produced by the president on social media. Isn't that all we have, though? Like, when you say the news flow produced by the president of social media, that you're just talking about the news, right? I mean, it's all just Trump's tweets.
Okay, this is turning into rather an enjoyable meta conversation at this point. You don't need to be as old as I am to remember a time when there was more to news than what one 79-year-old man had put out on social media.
Not just any 79-year-old man. I mean, he is...
Unfortunately, it's the most powerful. I think what you play into here, though, is that under the old rules of doing politics, That's not the kind of brinkmanship behavior that happened. In general, if you're thinking of intervening militarily, you do not talk about it. You certainly don't broadcast it to however many million followers Donald Trump has. One of the things from the tariff situation, the number of different tariffs that have been announced, and I guess they're news because he said he's going to do them, and they never happen. I remember one weekend, it's about 4 months ago, do you remember there was going to be a 50% tariff on Colombia?
Yes.
And it lasted about 5 or 6 hours. I was sort of desperately swatting up on the Colombian economy, just like I've been swatting up on the Iranian economy. But it's like if a tree falls in the wood with nobody to see it. If a tree doesn't fall in the woods, but somebody tweets about it, does it mean that the tree has in fact fallen? You know, I mean, they're trying to sort of invert it. But if we're living in a reality where the news is every time the president vocalizes something on his mind, that's not normally how leaders communicate. And markets don't normally have to deal with this huge dilemma of, do I take this seriously or don't I?
We're really excited to have Megan Greenwell with us. She is a Bloomberg Businessweek contributor and author of the new book, Bad Company, Private Equity, and the Death of the American Dream. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was super excited about this conversation, not only because Megan's book is great, you are investigating how private equity affects people's lives, their communities, the economy, but also because this topic is super newsy right now. We're at this moment where private equity, after being this ridiculously successful asset class from an investor perspective, is facing all these challenges. Places like Yale are trying to get out of their investments in private equity, trying to sell their holdings in private equity. And meanwhile, the private equity industry is desperately trying to bring the rest of us, regular people, into the asset class via their 401ks, trying to get these businesses into your retirement plans, into my retirement plans. And I thought we could talk about that as well.
Yes, definitely a lot to discuss. Megan, before we get started, would you mind defining private equity for us? What is private equity and how does it work?
Private equity bundles money from various types of investors. So university endowments, public pension funds, ultra-wealthy individuals, investment firms, whatever. But then they combine that money together with huge bank loans to take over companies in what they call leveraged buyouts. So often people confuse private equity and venture capital. Venture capital is investing in startups and taking a piece of that company. Private equity, for the most part, is executing these leveraged buyouts to take over companies wholesale.
They want to take them over in order to...
I mean, ideally, they'd like to take them public.
I mean, they need to sell them, basically.
Yeah.
Either selling them to the public via an IPO
it's like
or
flipping
something.
houses, where you like, we're going to buy this house, we're going to install a new kitchen, shine it up, and then sell it for triple what we paid to buy it.
Yeah, except a lot of the time, these are kind of either declining businesses or businesses that are healthy but in shrinking industries,
yes,
or businesses that are troubled in one way or another, right? And the whole point of the private equity firm is they're going to very quickly, and you said it in your answer, like turn things around, cut costs, and then it'll be worth more, and they will get paid along the way, and then also, hopefully, if everything works out, sell for a higher price than they bought for.
And what kinds of businesses are they in right now?
One of the interesting things about reporting this book was seeing the evolution of which businesses they used to be in versus which ones they're in now. So I write in the book a bunch about Toys R Us, which was acquired by two private equity firms.
RIP.
Yes. Two private equity firms and a real estate trust in 2005. And at that time, retail was huge for private equity. They really wanted in on big retail chains because they were under threat from Amazon. But there was some thinking that a bunch of them could still be saved. What ended up happening was a bunch of them were saved, but not the ones owned by private equity. But now, for the most part, private equity is largely out on retail. Now you see a ton of private equity in hospitals, veterinarians, dentists, preschools, all of these kind of like recession-proof industries because like your kid has to go to preschool and your grandma needs to go to a nursing home regardless of how the economy is doing. So you can really like trace that evolution over time and also see how they use the same playbook in retail businesses like Toys R Us and now are using it in businesses like hospitals.
I mean, the whole argument of this book is that private equity and the way it does business is bad. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for these businesses. Can you just lay that out for us, like why you think that's the case? The subtitle is Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream.
That does sound bad.
Yeah, it sounds bad.
So I think private equity is really good for private equity firms and pretty good most of the time for their investors, though it's complicated. And it turns out to be very bad for the companies they acquire and their workers and the communities that rely on them. And one of the biggest reasons for that is when they take out these loans to acquire a company, the debt for those loans is assigned not to the private equity firm that made the decision to take them out, but actually to the company it's acquiring. So if I come in and buy Toys R Us, in this case, what happened was Toys R Us was purchased for something like $6 billion, and $5.2 billion of that was loans, and only Toys R Us itself was responsible for paying that debt back. And Toys R Us had always been a very fiscally conservative company. They did not have a lot of debt ever. Now, all of a sudden, they were just buried under interest payments, and their private equity owners were not helping them repay that money. And so the reason Toys R Us went out of business was not Amazon. It was the fact that they didn't have any money to compete with Amazon or anybody else because they were so buried under interest payments.
Well, it's kind of like how if you're an investor flipping houses, you might borrow against the property that you're flipping, right?
Yes.
It's exactly like that. I guess the difference is that a lot of these businesses have an importance to the community that may be viewed from the 30,000 or 50,000, whatever, faraway view of a bunch of Wall Street investors. It just looks like an asset, and an asset that you can maybe try to optimize. If it fails, who cares or whatever. But up close, there's like a real human cost.
Yeah. So in the case of Toys R Us, I focus on this woman who was supporting her family of 5 single-handedly on a Toys R Us salary. And when she and 33,000 Toys R Us workers lost their jobs, their contracts guaranteed severance. But because it was a bankruptcy brought on by these huge loans, they didn't get any severance. And so now all of a sudden you have this situation where all of these people are out of jobs and cannot feed their families. Meanwhile, Toys R Us, yes, it's a big box store, but it was an important part of a lot of communities, tax revenue-wise, also like seemingly dumb little things like sponsoring the local Little League team.
You said that private equity has been good at making money for private equity investors. I'm curious, the Trump administration, and in particular, the people running the SEC for Donald Trump, are very interested in basically getting rid of the barriers that prevented normal people. Do you think that that actually makes sense for a normal investor?
Well, and we should say that right now, from what I understand, 401ks can't invest in private equity.
Not just 401ks, but like regular people can't invest. You have to be what's called an accredited investor, meaning you have to show that you either have a decent amount of sophistication or wealth or both.
And there's a push now to kind of get rid of some of those barriers, let people in, and private equity's
good thing,
right,
Megan?
That.
Oh, totally. Private equity has to disclose very little about how it operates, where its money is going, or even how it's performing. So if you are not a very, very highly trained, very obsessively observant investor, I would be very nervous about getting involved in private equity.
So do you think that 401ks will start getting into private equity?
So, private equity is very excited about this possibility because it would give them literally trillions of more dollars at their disposal. And so if you're looking to fund other private equity acquisitions, you're a bank or something, that starts to look pretty good too. It would give private equity so much more power in our economy, and it is already so powerful in our economy. So, yes, I think it is very likely to happen.
What's your sense of why private equity firms are suddenly really excited about getting retirees money instead of just having pension funds and university endowments and the sort of, quote unquote, institutional investors who in the past have been their main source of capital?
Part of it is the private equity industry is just worried right now. Their rates of return have gone down. Yale is now pulling a bunch of its money out of private equity.
They have a big endowment. They're huge investors.
Correct.
Why are they pulling out?
They are pulling out because they are concerned about, having their money in their long term, whether it's going to pay off well enough for them long term. The Pennsylvania State Public Employees Pension Fund recently did something similar where they downscaled the amount of money they have in private equity, because even if they're getting good returns year to year, they're just worried that A, they're not getting enough information to really know, and B, they're not performing at the level that private equity is promising over the long term. They just want to make sure they're proactive in finding new sources of capital. And part of it is this requires a regulation change. And I think Donald Trump has really stacked his inner circle with private equity people. And it is a good time to sort of say, hey, buddy, all that money we gave to you during the campaign cycle, give us this little favor in return.
What is the danger here? What is the real danger that you see of the trajectory we're on of private equity getting involved in kind of new industries and growing and potentially getting 401k money? Where does this end, or why is this potentially a problem?
I think as private equity swallows more and more of our lives, we see the effects of that in more and more ways, right? So, classically, when private equity comes in, prices go up and quality of care goes down. That is one thing when it's like Toys R Us. That is a much bigger problem when it is a hospital. So I write about this doctor in rural Wyoming who I followed for 2 years. The hospital he worked at got taken over by private equity. And all of a sudden, you couldn't deliver a baby at that hospital. And it's rural Wyoming. So that means you can't deliver a baby within 30 miles. And that's 30 miles through a windswept canyon in a Wyoming winter. So I do think that in very real ways, people's quality of life and actually people's real lives, people's life or death is determined by this in ways that private equity firms don't seem particularly invested in. And as that continues to grow and grow and grow unchecked, we need to have a reckoning about the real world effects of this industry that doesn't really care about the rest of us having that kind of power.
And is getting into sort of more personal and sensitive parts of our lives.
If they're in your hospital and your grandma's nursing home and your kid's preschool, they're in public utilities now, they own a lot of landlords, they can really run your entire life, in a lot of cases without you even knowing it. And so then you don't even have the information, much less the ability to sort of push back and say, no, I want to live my life under some different model of capitalism.
Megan, thank you so much for talking private equity with us. The book is called Bad Company. It's such a great read. Check it out.
Stacey, it's time to talk about our underrated story of the week. I think the story we need to talk about this week is the Trump Mobile.
I love the
mobile
Trump phone
that Trump is using, my new mobile carrier, I can only assume. But right as we were getting in the studio, you called an audible.
Okay. So, Max, you wrote a feature piece this week, which I have not been able to stop thinking about. And it is about someone very similar to Donald Trump in a lot of ways. Very famous entrepreneur, hit television show, someone kind of known for straight talk, who's very much connected to our day-to-day lives, Mark Cuban.
Yeah, the funny thing is your tease worked, whether or not we were talking about Cuban or Donald Trump. But yeah, Businessweek published a story about Mark Cuban, and it's a profile of his latest thing, which is a attempt to make healthcare prices lower. But it's also a look at this very unlikely political figure. People probably remember that Cuban was sort of involved tangentially in the 2024 election as a surrogate for Kamala Harris, although not a very
when not judging Shark Tank.
Yeah,
which he's most famous for.
Right, he's famous for previously owning the Dallas Mavericks, being a star of Shark Tank, being this kind of, just like Donald Trump, like a kind of professional billionaire, a guy who plays a billionaire in the media. And you might think First of all, he's not that liberal. He's basically a centrist. He's a fan of Ayn Rand. And in any case, he is not a conventional Democratic politician. And that is kind of why, actually, a lot of Democrats are excited about him.
Has he talked about running for president, or has his name been floated?
His name has been floated because at various times over the last 10 years, he has said he might run for president. He told me in our interview that he is not interested in running for president.
This is always the line.
Which is a little bit different from saying, like, you're definitely not going to do it. It wasn't what I think is called a Sherman-esque denial. It was a denial, but one that, of course, you could imagine changing. And when you look at kind of what he's doing, he is acting like someone who is at least exploring the possibility. And that's what I heard when I talked to political consultants on both sides of the aisle.
Well, the thing that really struck me is the idea of the power of being a public businessman. That was a lot of why people like Trump, too. He's just known to be a businessman. He's a successful businessman. He plays one on TV. And Mark Cuban also has that, where you look at him, it's like, oh, that guy knows what he's doing. He can take care of the economy. Even this election, when immigration was a huge issue, economy is always the top issue for voters. And that was really interesting to me, that was kind of Trump's superpower. People kind of de facto trusted him, and that Mark Cuban might have that quality too.
Yeah, I mean, the other interesting thing about Cuban is that he's able to simultaneously be moderate. He said things like he wants to cut the deficit, things like that, while also sounding like a populist. And like that has been one of Donald Trump's like secrets to his success.
Yes.
So Cuban is simultaneously sounding like a moderate while also railing against the insurance industry, sounding basically not that different from like Bernie Sanders on an issue like healthcare, although advocating very different policy positions. And there's something like inherently funny about the idea of like a Mark Cuban who's sort of famous for, like you said, playing a billionaire on TV and also like shouting at the Dallas Mavericks from the sidelines and getting in trouble for shouting.
And also giving people like the little guy a shot at their dreams, funding these tiny companies.
Oh, yeah.
Like, what's more American dream than that? I love Shark Tank. It's so emotional. It's all about business, which, of course, I spend all my time thinking about. And I love small businesses. I'm just thinking if Mark Cuban did become president, he could do like a Shark Tank for like bills, right? Like people bring their proposals. They could Shark Tank the bills. I would not hate that.
Mark Cuban, Stacey Vanek Smith is available. Just email her.
Chief of Staff
at
position, Secretary of State.
Bloomberg.net if you're interested.
Absolutely.
Stacey, we've had a lot of reviews come in for the show.
Yes, we have. Thank you, everybody who's left a review. It's been wonderful.
You promised, and I agreed, that I was going to write a haiku.
Yeah, I promised that you would write haikus for
every reviewer.
Yes.
And I am behind. But luckily, you have stepped in and written one for us. Do you want to tell us about it and then perform it?
Yes. Well, I based mine on the economic principle of negativity bias, which means that if your salary goes up by 5%, you're like kind of happy. But if it goes down by 5%, you are furious. And so this happens with ratings, too, right? Like most of our ratings have been very, very positive, and it's been lovely to see. And we've been really excited.
Yeah, but we didn't want to leave out the haters.
No, because
a hate listen is still a listen.
It's still a listen. We did get a 1-star review from Guy Inchy. And he said that there was a liberal bias. So here's my haiku for him. This is for you, Guy. To the Guy Inchy, who says we are too liberal. My dad thinks so, too. He does.
Shout out to Stacey's dad.
Shout out to you, Dad.
But listen,
love you.
Keep leaving the reviews, and we are grateful. There are actually a bunch of positive reviews here.
Yes.
Grimace and Trumpets, Norzeg, Sean Michael Mann. We appreciate you too, and we will have more haikus in the days that come as people leave more reviews. Please do, and we will hit you up. Stacey will write you another poem.
What? No,
or me.
This is supposed to be you.
Okay, or me. Okay, I'll do it. And thank you again for leaving those reviews. Keep them coming. This show is produced by Stacey Wong. Magnus Henriksen is our supervising producer. Amy Keene, our editor. And Brendan Francis Noonan is our executive producer. We get engineering help from Blake Maples and Dave Purcell fact checks. A big thank you to Laura Millan, Rodrigo Orihuela, Clara Hernandez Lizarraga, and of course, our good friend Jeff Muskus. Sage Bauman heads Bloomberg Podcast. And we got to say thank you to the parents who helped us collect that audio. You are awesome, and your kids are so cute. I'm not talking about my kids, by the way. And if you have a story that we should be talking about, email us at everybodies@bloomberg.net. That's everybody with an S at bloomberg.net. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.